Welcome back, everybody, from the little screen break. Next, I'd like to introduce Maya, who will be doing a special performance for us. She is a poet, storyteller, youth advocate, and student of many. She will be presenting her poem, What Else Could We Have Done, as the Midnight Rose. However, today she is unfortunately not able to be with us. So I believe there's a recording available. Yes. So we will be watching the recording.
The event took place in early May. Far from this place of dismay, that place was where our happiest moments came from. So what else could we have done? In our desperate attempts to preserve it, we pretended to know nothing of its existence. Your attacks were far too persistent, so we did everything we could to resist them. So tell me, what else could we have done? You flipped this world upside down by masking dark deceptions, claiming your actions were all in good intentions, but for us, today's generation, that answer will never be enough. Your calls to build trust between us we can now only perceive as bluff, so please, tell us, what else could we have done? Despite the fact that you have the world at your fingertips, you still find it hard to handle something this genuine. The beauty of our gardens made you breathless. That beauty got rid of your rigidness and forced you to see the world with a more fluid perception. It stripped you of your godliness and forced you to be human again. There's nothing bliss about the world you made. All it does is create more heartache. The impacts you made are not beautifully woven patterns, but instead dulled bloodstains on the clothes of history. So do not question the decisions we made. We had no choice but to provoke a change in hopes of correcting the mistakes made in early May.
Yes, snaps all around. Um, that was a special performance because Amaya has been with us since the very beginning in helping to plan this summit.
Okay, exciting. Okay, so I kind of had like everything already and stuff. So this time, like I said before, this is the first time I've ever displayed my own work. And while I did perform it way differently than I usually do, usually there's a lot more movement and choreography. I wanted to make sure that I was still. Thank you, thank you. I wanted to make sure that I was still during the performance, just to kind of display the grief that I felt when I wrote this poem. I wrote this poem in November of 2020, and it was just kind of it was me talking about all my frustration. Life here in America as a Black queer person is like it's difficult because a lot of times it feels like my country fails me over and over and over again. And so thank you. And so when I wrote this poem, I wrote it with the perspective of personifying a generation, which is my generation. So like the youth. And it's us talking to all the people that are in power, all the, politicians that could have done something better but chose not to. Like when it comes to climate change, right? Like our leaders knew about climate change over half a century ago. I mean, over half a century ago. And and they still chose not to do anything about it. So now once they're gone, we have to fix that. And it's frustrating because there's so many messed up things that could have been avoided, but they chose not to. So that was just kind of my thought process behind my poem, and kind of the reason why I performed it the way I did. Usually, like I said earlier, there's a lot more movement, and I try to be confident, but I wanted to show this vulnerability and some insignificant, and show how like insignificant sometimes I feel, right? Like you feel small sometimes. And I wanted pauses to be painfully awkward because sometimes that's what it's like. You call out to them and they don't listen to you. So, yeah, please ask questions. I'm kind of rambling at this point.
So, Amaya, talk
Yes.
a little bit about what you have learned. So, tell him about the award you won, and then talk a little bit about what you've learned about yourself through this process.
So I am I was state champion for poetry out loud. So that's kind of why I was like, just selected to do this. Poetry is my passion. What I've learned about myself in this in writing this poem is that like just kind of recognizing how much pain there was, because sometimes you don't have time to process it. Again, being a black queer person in America, sometimes you do everything you can to survive and you don't really live your life. And this poem was me kind of addressing that, like, look, it's hard right now. And this is how I feel, and I have to admit that. So that was kind of what brought me to write this poem. And that's kind of what I learned about myself in this, is that like I'm hurting and that's okay, but still I can do something about it, And so writing this was kind of making something good and beautiful out of a dark situation. Thank you for asking that question. Should we share the link? Yeah, sure. Go ahead. But yeah. And then another thing that I probably should mention is there was kind of thank you, a person that kind of inspired it. Greta Thunberg is a huge inspiration for this poem. In her speech when she talked to, I think she was at the United Nations. Okay, thank you. At the United Nations, and she was talking to our world leaders, and she said that the what was her quote? The young people are starting to understand your betrayal, and I say, if you choose to fail us, we will never forgive you. And that hit different, because it's true. Like they chose to fail us, and they still continue to choose to fail us. So that was a huge inspiration when I wrote this poem. Can you talk about your process? Do you say phrases out loud first or write things down? So this kind of took me, so I just kind of, this took me a little bit to write. At first it started off as a class assignment because we were doing our poetry unit. And it was just kind of, so I would pick out an emotion, right? And I would try to kind of make a story with that emotion. And so the story that I came up with was, so I was like, okay, what is something that is pure and something that can be corrupted? So then I thought of like the story with the Garden of Eden, right? So I reference gardens a lot in this. And the Garden of Eden is supposed to represent like the state of when everything was okay. So as a person, as a generation grows up into a world that is increasingly more distressing, more, with more horrific events happening every single day. It's something that was pure at first and now it's being corrupted. So I kind of, maybe I'll reference another like story or something. And the storyline for this was I have this emotion of betrayal and hurt. So let's personify a concept or a thing. So in this story, there was a generation talking to another generation, personify them, and make sure there's a conversation between the two. Why did you choose your poem as your medium? Did anyone inspire you to become a poet? I grew up with a lot of old school Black artists. I listened to a lot of jazz. I grew up with listening to Lauryn Hill, Jill Scott, Billie Holiday, Andrew Day, and of course Louis Armstrong. Like I grew up with all of these, Nat King Cole, like all these Black legends. And poetry is somewhere that I can find peace in. Because it is something that can be interpreted in so many different ways, and it's so beautiful. Like it doesn't matter who you are; anyone can be a poet. What other topics do you like talking about in your poetry? There are a lot of works that I have that I don't write them. Sometimes I write my poetry as a way to cope. Um, Currently this year I've dealt with a lot of mental health issues. Of course I'm getting treatment now, but to cope with all of that, it was kind of I wrote a lot about like my feelings and just how dark it gets in this mind of mine. Like, yeah, I can like a lot of times when it came to like me understanding my emotions, I will write poetry or a prose piece um to kind of like admit that I feel this way, to not be afraid of that. Because sometimes when you do have dark feelings, it can be scary to admit that you have those feelings. And so topics are usually pretty dark because it's way how I cope. But sometimes I'll also write a poem to preserve a feeling or a new emotion when I first feel it. So yeah. Is there anything else? What goals do you have for the future? More specifically, what do you hope your work inspires? Oh goodness. So I've just gotten into the youth advocacy thing like throughout I think like in the past like 2 years, my whole world has just kind of been flipped because I see a lot. I've done like community service and I've done mentoring um and you know I've been a student of many people, and it's kind of me taking what I've learned and now I'm using my skills to do something. Right, I see how dark this world can get, and I'm doing my best to not only discover me but to help others, to make life not just livable but a wonderful thing. So I do. Yes, poetry is most definitely a source of healing. I agree with that. Um, so yeah, I do plan on doing some more advocacy work, especially in the arts because that's kind of what my calling is. um, how how has your experience been with poetry section in your class? There was a lot of expectation because I was a poetry champion, so people were kind of like, "Oh yeah, she's gonna be good at this." So it was a little nervous, but it kind of came naturally to me because again, that's my passion, and it's something that I'm good at. So it was also like kind of like my moment to shine a little bit, because it's poetry and I'm a poet. So yeah, it was great. I loved it. Is there anything else? How are we doing on time? It's that vulnerability that gives you power. Yes, I agree 100%, Kay. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.